in a series that we've called The Real Real. We're talking about faith, and we're using Hebrews chapter 11 as a bit of as a textbook, a study guide. Hebrews, the letter in the New Testament, was written to people, early Christians, most of whom at that time in that audience had converted from Judaism to Christianity. This was a very intense time in history to be Christian. There was no Christian history to speak of. It was a first-generation church. They were new, and they were also living, existing, and trying to grow this Christian movement under the oppressive regime of the Emperor Nero. In fact, most of the scholars that date Hebrews date it right in the middle of Nero's reign. Nero was very hostile to Christians. When the fires happened in Rome, Nero was famously, not really paying attention and playing his instrument and kind of ignoring the fires, but he blamed the fires on the Christians. And so what happened was Christians under Nero were persecuted. Many were brought to the Colosseum where they were fed to lions in front of massive crowds. It was a terrible time to be a Christian. And so in that context, you've got all of these new Christians who've converted from Judaism. Now, Judaism was an approved state religion. So it was okay to be a Jew. It was not okay to be a Christian. As you can imagine, while they're watching their friends being eaten by lions, they're thinking, I don't know if it's worth it, right? Like that's an okay thought to have. Is this actually worth it? So there was a lot of pressure on those early Christians to revert back to what was comfortable, what was known, what was easy, what was accepted. And so Hebrews is written to strengthen the faith in a group of people whose faith was, by and large, faltering and failing. Many had converted back, and it was this effort to say, whoa, stay the course. Like all of Hebrews kind of has this same underlying tone. You can do it. It's going to be worth it. You can make it. So the author uses in particular Hebrews chapter 11 to outline all of these heroes of the faith, their stories, these major accolades. Here's why you can stay the course, because these people did it and it worked for them. You read it, and for us it reads like a highlight reel, but to them they understood because they had come out of a Jewish background. So when they saw mention of Gideon and mention of Moses and mention of Abraham and mention of David and mention of Daniel in the lion's den and mention of all these, Joshua marching around the wall, mention of all these moments, they knew that there was a real story behind the real. You get what I'm saying? Like when we read it, because we don't necessarily have all the historical context like right there, it's easy to read it and be like, oh, Hebrews 11:29. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea onto dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. It's easy to read that and be like, man, faith is so simple. Look how easy faith is. You just walk across the sea and it splits and it's dry, and that's wonderful. Like I want faith like that. But the readers knew from growing up in Jewish culture what it meant, that they didn't actually just walk across. There were some details. There was a story. There were things that happened. And so into a modern context today, first of all, let's be grateful we're not being fed to lions. That's a good thing, right? Like we have a lot to be thankful for. I know sometimes it can get easy to forget that. We got a lot to be thankful for, so glad that's not my reality. But for moments when we do feel like our faith is under attack, and moments when we have in many ways reduced faith to a religious practice or title instead of a lifestyle, I believe Hebrews can be very applicable to us in challenging some of the things we're facing, helping us stand firm in faith when we're up against ideological warfare, when we're up against a shifting and changing of our culture and some apprehension to Christian traditional values. Hebrews is a resource. Help us rebuild our faith. And so I want to continue today. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at Gideon and how we need to have faith that endures. So faith that doesn't quit. Like when you want to quit, don't quit. That's faith. That's faith, practically speaking. We looked last week at the early part of the Exodus of the Israelites. Exodus just means exit, to leave. We looked at that early part and identified that, hey, we all need a leader. Everybody, we all need a leader. Faith follows a leader. follows a leader when you don't understand everything, follows God when you're not sure that his plans actually make sense. Faith follows. We all need a leader. But I want to continue looking at the historical account of the Exodus today. The Israelites moving from Egyptian captivity into God's promise. And we're going to pick up their story in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Okay, so context, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, but the Israelites are on the edge of the Red Sea. The Egyptians are bearing down behind them, and the Israelites are terrified, like they're scared. And Moses, don't forget, Moses has no leadership experience. He's been a shepherd for 40 years. Before that, he kind of bailed on the whole royal family and just left town, okay? So he hasn't led a church before. He hasn't led a movement before, but God comes to him and says, hey, man, I want you to start this thing. Like, just no big deal, 600,000 men plus women and children. You be their leader, and I trust you. It's going to be awesome. So he doesn't have much context. There's not a lot of training other than God saying, I'll be with you. I am who I am. I'll be whatever you need in whatever situation you find yourself in. Now go and lead all these people. So Moses is standing there with the people freaking out, the Egyptians coming, and the Red Sea standing in front of him. And he says, do not be afraid. I feel for him. He's got a whole bunch of people mad at him, and he's just trying to muster up a little bit of courage. You know, poor little guy. He's 80 years old, but he's trying to muster up some courage. Like, don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. And then under his breath, it's probably like, I hope, God, can you please? The Egyptians you see today, you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you. Now, if by chance you happen to have Exodus 14:14 tattooed anywhere on your body, just close your ears. This next 60 seconds is not going to be helpful for you, okay? Not helpful. Because he says in 14:14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. I'm sure even in the moment, a lot of the angry Israelites were like, man, Moses, that is really good. Does anyone have a needle? I've got some space right here. I need that. I need Exodus 14, but Moses 15 hadn't been said yet. So you got all these Israelites now rolling up a sleeve to get the Exodus 14:14 tattoo. We need only to be still. And then God talks and says, why are you crying out to me? Whoa, hold up. Tell the Israelites to move on. Oh, how far did you get? Oh, man. It's like a regret tattoo. Regrets. Now, here's the thing. There are moments when something can be true, but not true in this situation. It can be right, but not right in this situation. That's a better way of putting it. So everything Moses said in his attempt to lead the people it was good stuff. It's good preaching. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. God will deliver you. The Egyptians are done. The Lord will fight for you. But it's this last bit that gets him into trouble. Because he says, you need only to be still. Now, there are moments when you need to be still. There are moments when you need to quiet your heart before the Lord and listen and reflect and soak and do all the things. But this wasn't one of those moments. And we have to be able to determine the difference between being still before the Lord, and you can be anchored and rooted and not give up and not be still. You can be convicted and have a firm foundation and a firm footing and not be still. And in this situation, the instruction God wanted to give was not the same as the instruction Moses gave. Moses said, you need only to be still. And God says, what? Moses, why are you crying out to me? And also, I never told you to say that. Tell them to move on. Listen, it's March. We got to move on. It's March 2022. Move on. We got to move on from the way we've been thinking, the way we've been living, the way we've been acting, the way we've been treating other people. We have to move on. And so if you're titling the talk today, and I'm sure 97% of people are taking notes, so I'll give you a title because it's helpful. We're going to talk about the miracle of moving on. The miracle of moving on. Like moving on. When you tell somebody to move on, there's a few different ways that it gets used. If you're a parent, it sometimes sounds like get over it, kind of the same thing. Your kid's hemorrhaging, you're like, get over it. Wrap it up, put a Band-Aid on it, you'll be fine. We don't have time for that right now. It's okay to use that with your kids. Don't use that like with your spouse, your significant other. It's not helpful to tell them to move on. Hey, you move in. You do whatever you need to do. I'm just here for it. That's fine. We use it a lot in like relationships or when you're trying to give somebody a push after a difficult season. Don't use it as a breakup line either. Hey, you know what? It's time for you to move on out of my life. It's not helpful. But it's like the advice we like to give people. Well-meaning, good intentions. Hey, you know what? He's a dog. Move on. Hey, you know what? Like, that job's not working out. Move on. Hey, we use this to try and help people get out of a space that we get into after, issues, traumatic experiences. And so I want to be sensitive to the fact that there are times, there's a time for healing, and a time for mourning, and a time for grieving, and a time to put on your Lululemons and smash a tub of Ben & Jerry's and watch rom-coms. There's a time. There's a time to freak out and be like, oh, I need to control everything just for a second to figure out what's going on. There's a time. But you can't stay there. And there was a time for the Israelites to be a little terrified because it's terrifying. But they can't stay there. They can't stay there. And we have to be so careful that we don't make permanent what God wants to be processed. And so there are things that will be necessary to your process that you can't get too comfortable in because God didn't send that into your life to become permanent. And the Israelites are predisposed, we see it over and over and over again in their story, to try and take what God meant to be a season or what God meant to be part of their process and to get comfortable in it and think, well, if we could just stay here. If this could just be permanent, things would be more comfortable. The Israelites had a negative pattern of doing this over and over and over. Let's go back to Exodus 14, verse 8. And I want to read this, and you just look for it. I want to see if you can see the negative pattern that's happening in the Israelites. So it says, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, horsemen, and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Can you see there's a cycle happening, and we see it revealed in their actions, their emotions, and their words. We get on these cycles of actions, emotions, and words. Watch. So here's the cycle. There's this destructive pattern. And here's the thing about destructive patterns, is when you are in a destructive pattern, you think it's helpful. Nobody gets into a destructive pattern because they're thinking, I can't wait to destroy my life, right? If you're in a destructive pattern, you're oftentimes not aware of how destructive the pattern is, and you're in it because it's bringing some type of relief to the situation that you're facing. And so you need people in your life who are willing to call out destructive patterns and help keep you aware of what you're doing. So here's the pattern. This is what I see. It says they marched out boldly, then they were terrified, and then they wanted to go back to Egypt. It'll be easier if we put a little alliteration to it, okay? So they marched out boldly. They thought there was going to be a battle. So you're bold, then there's a battle, and then they wanted to go back into bondage. Or they marched out confidently, And then it looked like there was going to be conflict. And then they wanted to go back into captivity. Okay, I could alliterate this all day long. But here's the deal. We could also just take a quick look inside and realize that this pattern works itself in our lives over and over and over and over again. I'm confident. I feel ready. I can do this. It's harder than I thought. I didn't know it was going to be like this. This is kind of taking a toll on me. I never should have started. I just want to go home and eat Cheetos. Like we do this. There's this pattern. There's a parenting cycle here. And I'm killing it this morning. Everybody brushed their teeth. They were on time for school. By pickup, you're like, I am a terrible parent. My kids hate me, and I'm for sure visiting that one in prison. Oh, come on, you've thought that. And then at that point, you're like, does anyone want kids? Like, I've got several. I've never thought that. There's a relationship cycle that happens. Till death do us part. I love you so much. You're so incredible. I can't wait to spend every moment of every day with you. Oh my gosh, I love you. I love you. I love you. And then you wake up one day and you're like, oh my gosh, that's what you really look like. I've never thought that. I've never been in that situation. But hey, whoa, before you get all judgy, I saw you looking over there like, oh, does she know he's going to say those things? That's so rude. She's fine. A couple weeks ago, she sends me a picture. It's me like 5 years ago. All she says is, you looked really good in that picture. What's that? What's that supposed to mean? That's not helpful to anybody. Take my picture now. What do you think now? I'm trying. But it starts with like this confidence of like, oh, we're in it. We love each other. Then things start to shift and life happens and it's not what you thought it was going to be and it's more work than you anticipated it being. And then, wow, this doesn't feel like the person I married. And then maybe I'd be better off alone. It's a cycle. It's a business cycle. I've got this new idea. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm excited to bring this to market. I'm excited to get this out into the world. I'm excited to rally people around it. And it's a beautiful thing, all you entrepreneurs who are taking God-given ideas and using them to bring light and hope to the world. I mean, we've got amazing people doing incredible things in our church. Keep going. Often the cycle is, I've got this big idea and it's amazing, but then the economy sucks and it's not doing quite as well as I thought it was going to be. Business is difficult. My employees are all idiots. I should have stayed an employee. That was easier. I just got paid and I went home. I didn't have to think about anything. Maybe I could revert back. Don't do it. The world needs your unique idea, and the kingdom can use it for God's purposes. It's a spiritual cycle. God, I feel good. Worship was bumping today. I'm watching Chris dance around on his electric, just waiting for him to I asked him to do a solo. And I'm still waiting. Maybe in the response at the end today, maybe we can get a little tapping. Like I'm into it. That was my Van Halen guitar. Okay. But you come in and it feels good and you're excited and it's like, man, I'm ready to go. Oh, I needed that time in God's presence today. I needed to see everybody. And then Monday happens and you're frustrated. God didn't answer my prayer. I have questions that I can't answer, and the answers God's giving me, I don't understand. He's let me down. This isn't what I expected out of my faith journey. This isn't what I expected out of my church community. People bother me. Welcome to church. But then all of a sudden, it's like, well, why do I believe anyways? Why do I go anyways? Why would I be here anyways? You start to revert back to a life without Jesus. There are these cycles. It's a human cycle. And the thing is, it's not like, it would be so easy if the devil was the one like pulling us into these cycles, but he's generally not. This is confession time, I am a pathological liar. Not in every situation. Do you know that nobody lies to me as much as I lie to me? Nobody. Nobody lies to you as much as you lie to you. Sometimes we just get like, I am resisting the lies of the enemy. What if you just resisted your own lies? There's actually a lot more of those that you're believing than the devil doesn't actually have the time to hunt you down and whisper lies into your ear all the time. We give him a lot of credit. It's our lies. We lie to ourselves all the time, specifically about our past. We all tell ourselves a story about the past that is not accurate. Your interpretation of your past, I'm telling you right now, everybody, is not 100% accurate. Because you will tell a story about your past that you alter so that you can justify who you are and where you are in the present. We all do it. We lie to ourselves. The way we remember is constantly being distorted by our needs in the present. We romanticize the past. We have these idealized versions of what happened, and we just make it what it needs to be so I can feel good about where I am today. So there's positive distortion. It's just like this constant nostalgia, you know? Like I am a fairly nostalgic person. I'm sentimental, I'm emotional, I'm soft. But I always like every hockey season, when hockey season starts, I have this vision of being on the couch with the fireplace on. And my children are all around me. And my wife, she's there too. And we're all wearing Leaf jerseys. And we're cheering together. And someday they're going to win the cup. And I imagine this like it's been my reality. And I try and think back to moments like that. And I've got this nostalgia like we had that at some point. And then I'm like, we never had that. The girls all have Leaf jerseys. But then they're all like, it's not fashionable. That's what's happening now. It's like, it's not cool to wear a jersey, Dad. I'm like, Tanix has a jersey. He's like, Dad, it's itchy. I'd rather play video games. So I might get 3 minutes of like this nostalgic moment. And Natasha's like, well, if they're not wearing it, I'm not wearing it. And then it's just me alone. We have these we sanitize the past. We clean it up. We filter out the negative emotions and experiences. So what we do is we remember being relieved, but we forget the tension that existed that made it possible for us to feel relief. We remember joy, but we block out the trauma and the pain that was there that even made the feeling of joy something we could recognize anyway. So we've got this positive distortion, but there's also negative distortion. So some people resort to positive distortion and some go to negative distortion where we forget the good things and we focus on the bad things. So instead of remembering that you experienced joy at some point, all you can think about is that situation that caused you pain and heartache without the awareness to say, if I felt pain and heartache, I must have known joy at some point. There had to be joy to contrast the pain or I wouldn't be able to identify it as pain. And so we remember what our biased minds tell us to justify where we are. Positive distortion is often triggered by unsettling circumstances, turbulent times, change. That's why so many people in their 20s and 30s wrestle with this nostalgic positive distortion. They look back on what they think was a better time, not because what you're living in is impossible to get through, but because it's turbulent. And you're trying to think back to something that makes you feel better. It's not just 20s and 30s. It happens to any of us as we're walking through change and trauma and difficult seasons. Now, the Israelites are looking back with some positive distortion. If only we could go back to Egypt. It's so crazy. Like the positive distortion is seen even in their language. They say, if we could go back and serve the Egyptians. That's positive distortion. They were never servants of the Egyptians. To serve means you're getting a paycheck. And it's a choice. They were slaves of the Egyptians. They weren't remembering it right. That's why it's so dangerous to be like, if I could only go back into that relationship, because you feel like you were loved and accepted. Really, you were just taken advantage of and abused. But it's the positive distortion of having somebody overrides the negative things that were actually part of the relationship. And they're about to walk back into an abusive relationship. They've only been out of Egypt a week. 1 week. It doesn't take long for positive distortion to kick in. 1 week. 1 week of like walking around in the desert towards the Red Sea, and already they're like, we kind of want to go back. It was so much better being a servant. They're in this cycle. The miracle of moving on is that God wants to and can break those cycles. The reality for the Israelites, if they go back, they're not just cycling back to something that was a problem in their generation. They're falling back into a generational pattern of behavior. It was generational oppression. Because, see, they're going back to the same thing that oppressed their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and the generation before them, back 10, 12 generations of the same oppression. They're thinking, oh, let's go back to that. Now, last week, I celebrated Joseph. I was like, man, Joseph was the man. Joseph had some generational vision as he was on his deathbed. Now, Joseph was the first generation of Israelites to move into Egypt. He led the way. And when he was dying, he said, I want you to take my bones with you when you leave this place and inherit the promise. I don't want to stay here. Now, I don't think that Joseph thought it was going to be 400 years before somebody grabbed his bones and took off. I think he had more faith than that. If it was possible to be turning in your grave, I bet you Joseph was like, I am so uncomfortable in here. Why haven't we left yet? We celebrated that. So they had been slaves for 400 years, but they were in Egypt for 430 years, which means they didn't begin as slaves. When they first came to Egypt, there was a famine in the land. And in a time of famine, the Israelites ran out of food. The Egyptians, under Joseph's leadership and the guidance of God, stored up, saved up, prepared, had reserves. And so in order to survive, the Israelites went into Egypt. They came to Egypt for survival. But once it turned over from the first generation, they were no longer there to survive. They're there as slaves. So what one generation does to survive can become a curse on the next generation who finds themselves enslaved. Now, there's a lesson here about preparation and stewardship and saving and margin and how we build our lives. Because, listen, it wasn't the Egyptians that enslaved the Israelites. It was their lack of planning and preparation. The Egyptians just took an opportunity. We don't have time for that right now. Go to the Path Forward on Wednesday nights. But we have to recognize the principle that what started as survival ended up as slavery. And there are generational implications on this from all directions. First, and this is meant to be a comfort to somebody today, the chances are the struggle you have today, the thoughts, the behaviors, the patterns, the things you can't seem to shake, they might be your slavery, but if we believe in the power of generational curses and generational blessings, there's a great likelihood that it was someone else's survival. That somebody did something to survive in a generation ahead of you that you've now become enslaved by. I mean, I'm not here to talk politics, but let's just talk politics for a second. How about even the federal deficit right now? And I'm not talking about the ethics of it or the efficacy of it. The bottom line is a ton of money was printed and spent to try and help people survive in a season, and it has enslaved multiple generations. We'll probably never pay it off. But the same thing happens spiritually in our lives. So you might find yourself today living in a cycle of poverty. What is that? Well, you always feel like you never have enough. You're not great with your finances. Maybe you have a hard time living a generous life. Maybe you can't seem to trust God with your finances. Maybe you have trouble tithing. You're racking up debt. Listen, it might be a generational cycle of poverty that it was maybe back a few generations, there was somebody in your family who had to really save and really hunker down, and they were terrified that they wouldn't have enough, and they, actually living in poverty. None of us are actually living in poverty, but now we have that mentality because it's been passed on. Maybe if you're here and you're like, well, divorce runs in my family. I'm divorced. My parents are divorced. My grandparents are divorced. I got like an uncle that was married 32 times. Like, it's crazy. Our family tree is a mystery. Maybe that, but But don't fail to realize that there may have been some point in your past, in your family's past, where somebody needed to split from something just to survive. But now you are living in a slave position to this idea that that's who we are. Sexual confusion, immorality, insecurity, anger, stress, workaholic, alcoholic. I mean, there's a lot of things. There are a lot of cycles. We all have cycles. And so this was a constant struggle of the Israelites. They were always drawn back into a slavery mentality because their parents were slaves and their grandparents were slaves and their great-grandparents were slaves. So when the pressure was on, they didn't know what to do other than to go back to thinking like a slave. Now, here's the word of the Lord for anybody that, as I'm talking, can identify a struggle in your life that you know is linked to past generations. The word of the Lord to you is the same as the word of the Lord to the Israelites. Move on! Not to be insensitive, not to know that there's nuance and details and things, and it's not as easy as just saying move on, but move on. You can't stay here. You can't just be here. Move on. I'm believing that we represent a chain-breaking, cycle-breaking, curse-breaking generation. That I don't have to be what I was. We don't have to be what was modeled. We don't have to be what was passed down. We are who God says we are, and we'll do what He's called us to do. It breaks with us. We're a move-on generation. It might be, and this is the other side of all of this. It could be that what we do to survive, if we're not careful, becomes something that enslaves the next generation. I got to make sure that what I do to survive doesn't enslave my children. I got to be careful that how we navigate difficult seasons and how we try to survive doesn't handcuff the generation coming after us with a struggle that they didn't need to have, but we passed on to them. We've done a lot of different things to survive in this season. And for just a minute, if you're in the room, then I'm kind of preaching to the choir. If you're not in the room, though, and you're with us online today, can I implore you, like there have been measures in this season that we had to take to survive. Things that we were told to do, things that we had to do to be good citizens and navigate the complexity and there are real things at the heart of that. But if you're within driving distance of this building and you're still just watching online and you're medically able to be in the house, then we want you to be here. Don't keep surviving there when you could thrive here. There's room. And listen, whatever restrictions you embraced to feel safe, we're okay with. We still have masks at the door. We'll still do our best to accommodate seating for you. We just want you in the room. Online church was necessary at one juncture, but it's supplementary now. You cannot adequately replace what happens when we come together. So we'll make space for you. I'm just encouraging you, don't allow what was necessary for survival in one season to become something we're enslaved to in the next. If we don't prioritize meeting together in the house of God, like the Bible instructs us to do, if we don't prioritize the gathering of the saints, if we treat the church as something optional, don't be surprised when your children treat God as non-essential. What we do matters. It's the miracle of moving on. So the Israelites are about a week removed from Egypt. They've gotten out. They're free. They've taken a couple of turns, and they find themselves walking up on the Red Sea. It's a beautiful scene. Imagine with me. They're free. God is leading them to the promised land. All they really know about the promised land is that it's going to be flowing with milk and honey. That's kind of all the description they've gotten, which sounds like a stomach ache. But that's like, they're into it. So that's what they know. They come to the Red Sea, and all the Israelite women are slapping SPF 50 on all the kids. They're ready for a break, so they're just like in the sand. They're telling their kids to go. All the dads are back with the camping goods, blowing up the floaties, ready to pass out in the heat. Like, so they're just enjoying the moment because freedom feels good. But then all of a sudden, in the distance, they start to hear the thunder of horses' hooves coming on the ground. They start to hear the click-clack of chariots in the distance, and it's only a moment before the Israelites have been overcome by the Egyptians, and they're terrified. They freak out, and rightfully so. You and I would be scared too. It's easy to look at this and the situation that happens in Exodus chapter 14 and the little hissy fit that the Israelites throw and be like, man, that's so weird. Like, did they forget like all the cool things that God did? And how come they're freaking out now? It's like, just think about it. You got hundreds of chariots and armed soldiers right there. You're not trained for battle. You're not ready for war. You don't even really know where you're going. You've got a sea on one side, an army on the other. And so it's not like the Israelites didn't have faith. I mean, they packed up their whole lives and left what they had known for generations for the promise of like a milk and honey buffet. They were like, we're in. They followed. They not only are following a God that they had a really weird relationship with for 400 years, but they're following a man that they've never met. They're to a promised land they've never been to. You couldn't watch a preview. You couldn't check out the restaurant reviews on Yelp. You couldn't pre-book accommodations. Like, it's all new. And they lash out at Moses. You are the worst leader. We're just trying to go to the beach. Now the Egyptians are coming. This isn't what we expected. Where is the honey? Why are we here? Leave us alone, they said. That's all we said to you, Moses, was leave us alone. Just let us be servants to the Egyptians. They never said that. At no point, this positive distortion. They're filling in blanks to justify the fear they feel in the moment. They're blaming. See, blame is a method of escape. When you blame, you try to get out of taking responsibility for where you are. But what you do when you blame is you take the keys to your freedom and you hand them to the person that you've blamed. And so you're actually no freer through blame than you were without blame. You ought to just take responsibility for your own heart and your own condition and your own situation, and then maybe you can enjoy the freedom that God has for you. Most of them didn't even know Moses. He'd been gone for 40 years. He comes back to start this church with like 1 million people. No training, no nothing. He didn't have time to sit down and have coffee with every single person. I'd imagine that they're having conversations. What is he doing? What are the mission, vision, and values of this organization? If I can't sit down with Moses and talk about the values, we are out of here. Moses is like, guys, the value is staying alive. That's what we're trying to do here. If we stay, we die. If we move, we live. That's it. Let's go. He didn't have time to do that. If he was doing all that, they would have gotten nowhere. And of course, they're trying to follow a God they don't really know. And so it's like there are turns that they don't understand, and there are things that are uncomfortable. But he still brought them twice to the edge of the promised land. It was easy to criticize and blame him because they didn't know him personally, but this wasn't really on Moses. That's what's crazy. If you go back to chapter 14, verse 8 for a minute, it says, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites. Most of my life, I've just sort of skipped all of the Lord hardened verses. They're tough to wrap your head around. I was about 15. My parents were away. I don't remember where. I just remember that I wasn't old enough to have my license. And my grandfather was babysitting. And at like 1 a.m, I snuck out of my house with some buddies. We took my dad's car. And we went to not 15-year-old places. And, just had a night. It was fun. I remember coming back, pulling into the house, and my grandfather, like a ghost, was standing in the window at like 4 a.m. How am I going to talk to my dad about this? I remember having the thought, Lord, Dad, the Lord hardened my heart. He did it to Pharaoh. There's nothing I could do, but I'm sure he's going to get glory out of it somehow. This verse makes it pretty clear that the only reason the Egyptians went after the Israelites was because God made them. My head, my heart has a really hard time with that. Wait, I read it over. I checked other versions. I looked at it in the Hebrew. Is there a translation mistake here? No. God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would pursue the Israelites. That's a hard, you know what's really helpful? It's just to think that the Egyptians are like the devil and they just went after the Israelites and God helped them. That's like easy theology. I'm like, it's also incorrect. The thundering hooves, the click-clack, God's idea. And if we don't know how to bring these things to Jesus, that will mess up your faith. If we don't remember that all of the suffering we encounter is actually being used and leveraged by God to make us more like Christ. I'm not saying that's easy, but I'm saying the goal for your life is eternity with Him. And so there are things that we have to deal with here, and it's shaping us and forming us and allowing us to be like Jesus. And so when I read this, I'm starting to understand that God let the Egyptians, like the attack and pursuit of the Egyptians on the Israelite people was something that was released through the hand of God. The Egyptians are pursuing the Israelites. They overtook them. The same God who told them to go released an army to chase them down. Verse 9 says that they pursued and overtook them. You know, I'm starting to find a little bit of confidence in this truth. That like it was released through God's hand. They were overtaken. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says this: no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He'll not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So even though we will have moments when it feels like we've been overtaken, the promise of God is that you're never overtaken to the point where I can't get you out of it. And so I have great confidence, or like I'm trying to have great confidence, that even when I'm facing a situation, an enemy, opposition, trial, suffering, that God allowed it to get to me. Why would He allow it to get to me? I believe in the sake of the Israelites and in our sake. I said last week that they were a morally weak people. God allows these things to get to us because He's building us up, like I said, to be like Christ. I'm not saying that's helpful or comforting, but consider, if something had to, this is where I get my confidence, if it had to pass through God's hands to get to me, then if I go to God, He'll get me through it. If it had to go through God to get to you, then by going to God, you'll get through it. If it had to go through God, every bit of adversity, I'm not saying it makes perfectly good sense. There are things that we won't have the answers to until we're on the other side of eternity. But if it had to go through God to get to you, which anything that you face went through God to get to you, then you can go to God to get through the situation. And I don't know what situations I'm touching on today. I don't know what type of loss you've had to deal with. I don't know who's wrapped up in grief. I don't know the scope and the extent of your suffering. I don't know what you're wrestling out. I don't know what lies you're telling yourself about your past to try and justify where you are in the future. But I do know this, If it had to go through him to get to you, go to him and he'll get you through it. Verse 22 says that they walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. God is so committed to keeping us moving. God is so committed to breaking cycles. God is so committed to us moving on that he says to Moses, raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through. But listen, his motivation for faith in our lives, his motivation for miracles is not just our benefit. Verse 17 says, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. Second time we've seen this. Then he says, I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I, again, gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Listen, be encouraged. God will be glorified. And his motivation for working a miracle in your life is his glory. It's not my comfort. It's not my preferences. It's not what I want. It's his glory. God will get glory. At some point, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord. He will get glory. So we've got a choice. I can either see it or I can be part of it. And I want to be part of God being glorified. I want him to have his power be made perfect in my weakness. I want him to have access to every suffering area of my life so that I can confidently know that he'll get me through. And when he gets me through it, his glory will be revealed to the people around me. God will get his glory. And he's so committed to his glory that in this moment, we see the full of the triune God, the Trinity at work to deliver the Israelites. You have God the Father speaking. But then verse 19 says that the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. That is an Old Testament picture of the person of Jesus Christ who had been with the Israelites, positions himself between the Egyptians and the Israelites. That's exactly what he did for you and I on the cross. He took up position in between what wants to get you, the sin that easily entangles you, the shame that weighs you down, the enemy that wants to destroy your life. He has positioned himself in the middle as if to say, you don't have access to them. You don't have access to their future. You don't have access to that calling. Jesus positions himself as your defender. And then the pillar of cloud also moved from out in front and stood behind them. But here's the cool thing. You've got the presence of God seen through the Holy Spirit, and the pillar of the cloud moved behind them. Coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side, so confusion to the Egyptians. It's the only time that you see the fire and the cloud operating at the same time. You've got a cloud casting darkness over the Egyptians and light on the other side, giving the Israelites clear passage to the other side of the Red Sea. God is working on your behalf right now to get you through whatever it is that you're facing. God is speaking to you and giving direction. Jesus is standing in your defense, and the Holy Spirit is leading and guiding you. Come on, I want you to be confident today that if it came to you through God, you can go to him to get through it. God is speaking to you and giving clear direction to his church. Jesus is still defending his bride. He is the shield and defense of the church of Jesus Christ. And the Holy Spirit is still our guide and our leader, and we will get through because we go to him. I want to pray for everybody in the room from the front to the back and ask if you could stand up, everyone.